Okay, let's just deal with one aspect, which is the notion of monarchy and how that connects. Well, I've put the athletic child, but really how it affects exercise and physical activity, because it's quite an important concept. So, what do we mean here? Well, we've got mean or median ages in monarchy within the normal range, but mean ages for samples of adolescent gymnasts, ballet dancers, figure skaters, divers tend to be later than those of athletes in other sports. Now that's quite interesting. So what do they all have in common? So if you take gymnastics, ballet, and figure skaters, well, fundamentally they're all aesthetically orientated sports. They are sports where, to some degree, there is a restriction on energy intake in order to increase the power to weight ratio of those athletes. Now, if we look, this is a fairly small data sample that I've got here, but if you take this sample of 15 ballet dancers and they followed them from 12 to 15 years, and what they found breast development occurred at later ages, pubic hair development, however, was expected ages, but fundamentally, this is quite an interesting development. If you look at kind of the breast development, it's an indication of some form of suppression that is happening here in terms of moving from childhood into that kind of adolescence. And then if we look over kind of longitudinal data, so we take something like 11 to 14 years, and you look at this in rowers, again, breast and pubic hair development, when they looked at the age of monarchy and they looked at prospective data, and estimated growth velocities did not differ, though, from reference data for the general population. So what's the difference? Well, of course, in rowing, it is certainly less about restricting energy intake or controlling energy intake. In rowing, there's a high energy expenditure. So in that sport, there's a real implication here in terms of understanding the role of diet on development, and in this case, in terms of the notion of monarchy. And if we look at this data here, which is actually quite neat, so what we've got prospective studies and then we've got retrospective studies. And so if we just take the prospective studies to start with, and you can see that if you look, and we will pick out some key sports within here. So here's our figure skating. So here you've got the age when, in essence, monarchy develops. So if we take gymnastics, we use gymnastics as an example, you can see the spread is going from 14 all the way up to 16 years of age. If we then look at something like ballet, very, very similar response. It kind of conforms with what was on the previous slide. Diving to a certain degree, because again, there is a certain amount here where we tend to have smaller statures in divers, but compare that to something like swimming. So much earlier development in swimming, actually pretty standard onset for here. Tennis, again, slight delay, but not particularly different. But if we then look at that in respect to retrospective, which is kind of perhaps maybe slightly better data for us, you can see this perhaps more realistically. So here's the non-athlete population. You've got the extremes, but this is kind of the typical non-athlete response, about 13 years of age. You can see again in gymnasts, where it's a weight-restricted sport, you can see that distribution is being skewed to older ages. The same for ballet. And as we start to move away from these kind of weight-restricted sports, more aesthetically orientated, and we come to more of the morphological and into endurance-based sports, you'll notice actually, on the whole, they are sitting pretty much at the average point of the onset. Again, lending itself to this notion that there is an interactory effect here between energy intake and the onset of menarche. And if we just look at this, this is quite neat data set. So what we've got here, you've got children and adolescents. So you've got boys, girls, men, women. Okay? And there are some key characteristics that you can see that distinguish them. So if we look at, for example, the height in boys and the height in girls, again, pretty similar. Not surprisingly, enormous differences to men and women. And notice now, men are taller on the whole than women. So it tells us that it's really where the growth spurt, as we understand, the peak height velocity and you get that adolescence growth spurt. If we look at body weight or body mass, very similar in boys and girls, very big difference again in men and women. If we then though look at kind of constituents in here, so if we look at fat percentage is fairly similar between boys and girls, but suddenly look at the difference. Women now have a much higher percentage of body fat than men, and of course that is fundamentally due to developments in things like breast. There's a lot of buttock fat in females compared to males. So the net result is fat mass is much higher in females than it is in males, and fat-free mass, which is although similar in children, the fat-free mass is much higher in males than it is in females. So it's a real indication of those changes from childhood to adolescence into adulthood in these kind of physical characteristics that you can see here.